Ghana in the dock, U.S. deportees, sue over unlawful detention, Africa's migration dilemma. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, your trusted channel for fearless analysis of Africa's biggest stories. I'm Zainab Karoma. Today, Ghana stands at the center of a global storm, U.S. deportees suing for unlawful detention. What does this mean for Ghana's democracy, Africa's sovereignty, and the future of migration on our continent? Stay tuned as we dig deep, compare across Africa, and give you the bold truth others shy away from. In early September 2025, 14 migrants from various West African countries were deported by the U.S. to Ghana under what is being described as a third country deportation deal. Some of those deported had already been granted protections in U.S. immigration proceedings. They couldn't be lawfully repatriated to their home countries due to torture, persecution, or inhumane treatment concerns. Soon after arrival, at least 11 of them sued the government of Ghana for unlawful detention, claiming they remain held in military or semi-military camps near Accra, under conditions that violate both Ghanaian law and international human rights norms. They seek relief in Ghana's High Court to force the government to justify their detention, i.e., a habeas corpus application, and block any further onward deportation to their home countries. The deportees allege, among other things, that they were held in a U.S. detention facility shackled and flown via military aircraft to Ghana under the agreement between Ghana and the U.S. Upon arrival, detained without due process, access to courts, or adequate legal recourse in Ghana. Conditions of detention are poor: unsanitary food, water, open-air or tented facilities, lack of basic amenities. Ghana's government, for its part, has issued counter-narratives. It maintains that 14 deportees arrived under the deal and that they have facilitated the return of nationals to their home countries. There is disagreement even within the government over how many of those deported have actually been sent on to their home countries. Some officials say all, others say most. Foreign Minister Ablakwa has defended Ghana's actions, calling them motivated by humanitarian principle and Pan-African empathy rather than any financial compensation. He also argues that the agreement is an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which, according to his interpretation, does not require parliamentary ratification immediately. Opposition parties and legal scholars in Ghana claim that under Ghana's constitution, the deal should be ratified by parliament and possibly be passed into law before it becomes binding. Critics argue that the lack of oversight or transparency raises constitutional, human rights, and sovereignty issues. Legal issues and rights involved. Some of the key legal, constitutional, and human rights issues emerging. 1. Constitutional protections in Ghana. Ghana's 1992 Constitution guarantees personal liberty, Article 14, and administrative justice, Article 23. Arbitrary detention violates those. The principle of habeas corpus, the right to be brought to court to contest the legality of detention, is central here. The deportees are asking Ghana's High Court to order their immediate release and require the government to justify their detention. 2. International law and non-refoulement. The international rule of non-refoulement prohibits returning persons to places where they would face persecution, torture, or inhuman or degrading treatment. Some of the deportees had U.S. court protections under Convention Against Torture, deferral of removal, or withholding of removal. Sending them back to their countries of origin might violate both Ghana's obligations under some treaties and international norms. 3. Due process and transparency. Were these individuals given proper notice about their deportation? Were they able to challenge the decision? Were judicial or administrative safeguards followed? These are being contested. Also, the condition of detention, lack of legal access, inadequate living conditions could amount to cruel or inhuman treatment. 4. Constitutional ratification and parliamentary oversight. If the deal is more than just a mere administrative understanding, Ghanaian law may require parliamentary ratification, or at least oversight, under Article 75 of the 1992 Constitution. Similar precedents. Previous Ghanaian arrangements, e.g., the Gitmo detainee transfers, were challenged in 2016 to 2017 on constitutional grounds for being unratified treaties. Forward-looking analysis. What could Shaitas Dai Bentwais Auque should happen? Here's what I see as the possible trajectories, needed reforms, and what to watch. 1. Court rulings in Ghana. The immediate future centers on the High Court in Accra. The 11 Deportees urgent application, habeas corpus interim injunction, was set for hearing on the 23rd of September, 2025. A ruling in their favor could force Ghana to release those detained, ensure access to legal counsel, improve conditions, and halt further deportations under the current MOU unless safeguards are in place. 2. Parliamentary and constitutional clarification. Ghana may need to clarify whether this MOU is just a temporary administrative understanding or a treaty agreement requiring ratification under Article 75. If Parliament deems it necessary, then lack of ratification could render the agreement invalid or unenforceable. Legal scholars might use past precedents, e.g., Gitmo detainee deals, to emphasize that treaties or agreements that commit Ghana's sovereignty or foreign policy in binding ways must go before Parliament. 3. International pressure and human rights norms. U.S. courts are already chiming in. U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan raised issues about bypassing U.S. judicial rulings and non-refoulement obligations. Global human rights NGOs will likely increase scrutiny. UN treaty bodies or special rapporteurs may get involved, especially if evidence of torture or persecution emerges. 4. Operational practical reforms. Ghana must ensure any persons accepted have access to due process, legal aid, information, ability to challenge further deportation, improve conditions of detention, water, shelter, sanitation, medical care. The reports so far, open-air camps, poor shelter, minimal food, are likely unsustainable both ethically and legally. Transparent vetting. Ghanaian authorities say they vet incoming deportees before accepting. Documenting that properly will be essential for both accountability and avoiding security issues. 5. Policy and diplomatic balancing. Ghana will have to navigate its relationship with the U.S., with ECOWAS, and with its own citizens. There is risk of becoming a de facto proxy for U.S. immigration policy, which may be unpopular domestically. Other ECOWAS member states may follow Ghana or reject similar deals. Standardization or regional guidelines, if any, may emerge as Africa grapples with similar pressures. 6th, precedent setting. Whatever happens here could set precedent across Africa for how African states deal with third country deportees, how external migration pressure is managed, how human rights obligations interact with bilateral agreements involving powerful states. Courts may use this case to clarify obligations under international treaties Ghana has ratified, e.g., Convention Against Torture, ICCPR, and how those interact with domestic law. Critical perspectives and risks, with a slight dash of irony. Sovereignty versus subservience. There is a fine line between helping, humanitarian principle plus Pan-African empathy, and being used as a dumping ground. Ghana has to ensure its sovereignty is not compromised or that its legal norms are not eroded in the name of external agreements. Risk of legal export of harsh U.S. policy. If U.S. policy is designed in part to evade U.S. legal constraints by using third countries, Ghana might become complicit in that evasion, risking moral and legal liability. Sort of like being asked to hold someone's unwanted box because they didn't want to ship it back home themselves. Here, could you store this box until we decide what to do? Domestic backlash. Citizens might question why Ghana would agree to accept non-citizens with no connection to Ghana, who may have been deported to other countries, possibly dangerous ones, particularly if Ghana has its own vulnerable populations, refugees, asylum seekers, human rights costs. The worst outcome, return of individuals to persecution, torture, or worse, which would breach both domestic constitutional rights and international law. Not to mention reputational risk. Latest news and key developments as of mid-September 2025. A Reuters report confirmed Ghana has agreed to accept West African nationals deported from the U.S., including 14 people already, and promised to assist with their onward return to home countries. Reuters. The AP and other outlets report that at least 11 of the 14 deportees remain in detention in Ghana, contrary to government statements that all have been repatriated. AP News +1. The lawsuit by these deportees was filed in Ghana, High Court Accra, asking for release and halting further deportations. Another lawsuit was filed in the U.S. by some of the deportees, with the help of NGOs, alleging mistreatment, straitjackets, only bread and water, in transit in military aircraft, and that their U.S. protections were bypassed by using Ghana as a third country. Judge Tanya Chutkan has expressed concern. What to watch next? The outcome of the 23rd September 2025 High Court hearing in Ghana. Will it grant the interim injunctions, review whether the detentions are legal, and possibly order release or improvements? Whether Ghana's government will formally present the MOU or similar deal to Parliament, or if Parliament will challenge the executive branch's power in this matter. U.S. judicial developments. Whether U.S. courts will order policy changes or whether the U.S. government will adjust its practices in light of lawsuits and criticism. Reactions from ECOWAS and other African states, whether they imitate Ghana, push back, or push for regional rules. Media attention and civil society pressure, both domestically in Ghana and internationally. The more public awareness, the harder it is to ignore human rights issues. Beyond Ghana, African case studies on deportation deals. 1. Eswatini's silent crisis. In 2024, 5 men deported from the U.S. were dumped in Eswatini and held without trial for over 2 months. Rights groups screamed foul, but the Eswatini government maintained radio silence. The detainees lacked access to lawyers and were confined under murky security grounds. The comparison is stark. Ghana at least has lawyers like Barker-Vormawor filing habeas corpus motions. Eswatini's detainees weren't even sure what they were charged with. 2. Rwanda's bold gamble. Rwanda, ever the bold risk taker, signed deals with the UK. Remember the Rwanda plan for asylum seekers, and reportedly accepted some US deportees as well. Kigali framed it as a business model. You pay, we host. Critics call it a commodification of human misery. Rwanda claims strong capacity to integrate deportees, but critics warn of secrecy, human rights gaps, and the risk of creating a holding hub for unwanted migrants. Ghana's situation, by contrast, isn't a commercial arrangement. No evidence of cash payments, but the optics of outsourcing still sting. 3. Nigeria's pushback. Nigeria, the regional heavyweight, has been more resistant. Officials have flatly rejected blanket third country deportation deals, insisting that only bona fide Nigerian citizens can be returned. With 200 million people of its own to manage, Nigeria is wary of importing stateless migrants who may later become a security or humanitarian burden. In fact, opposition MPs in Ghana are pointing to Nigeria's refusal as a precedent. If Nigeria says no, why should Ghana roll out the red carpet for Trump's deportations? 4. South Sudan's fragile acceptance. South Sudan has reportedly been another destination for U.S. deportees. But let's be real. A country struggling with famine, conflict, and displacement hardly seems like the logical place to dump vulnerable migrants. It raises the same question critics now ask about Ghana. Why are fragile states being made custodians of America's migration headaches, the geopolitics of deportation? This isn't just about Ghana's courts, it's about Africa's positioning in global power dynamics. The U.S. strategy. By offloading deportees into friendly African states, the U.S. sidesteps its own legal barriers. Like non-refoulement, it's like saying, we can't kick you out legally here, but we'll just ship you to Ghana and let them figure it out. Clever, maybe. Lawful, debatable. Moral, definitely questionable. Africa's bargain. African governments gain diplomatic brownie points and sometimes aid packages for cooperation. But the price tag may be sovereignty and dignity. Ghanaians are already asking, if America sneezes, must Ghana catch the flu? ECOWAS implications. Free movement within ECOWAS means once deportees land in Ghana, they could move freely into neighboring states. That makes this not just Ghana's headache, but a potential regional migration crisis. Nigeria's refusal might reflect an understanding of the spillover risks. Forward-looking scenarios. Scenario 1. The courts save the day. If Ghana's High Court rules the detention unlawful, the deportees could walk free. Parliament might be forced to ratify the deal, and Ghana would earn applause for upholding the rule of law. But it risks diplomatic tension with Washington, which doesn't like its deals unraveled in African courts. Scenario 2. Business as usual. The court punts, the executive continues the MOU, and more deportees arrive. Remember, the government has already signaled it's ready to accept another 40. This normalizes third country deportations in West Africa until something goes badly wrong, like a deportee being tortured back home. Cue a PR disaster. Scenario 3. ECOWAS collective response. If public pressure mounts, ECOWAS could step in to demand a regional framework. Imagine a deportation protocol requiring parliamentary approval in all member states before accepting third country nationals. This would shield weaker states from unilateral executive deals. Scenario 4. Public backlash in Ghana. With elections looming in 2028, this issue could become political dynamite. Opposition MPs are already sharpening their knives, accusing the government of selling Ghana's sovereignty. If ordinary Ghanaians start seeing deportees as a burden, or worse, a security risk, the ruling party may regret signing a deal without public buy-in. A dash of humor. The airport surprise. Picture this. You've just had a miserable detention in the US, shackled, put on a military plane, flown across the Atlantic. You think you're landing in Lagos or Monrovia, and boom, you're in Accra, where the authorities shrug and say, surprise, welcome to Ghana. Don't mind the military camp. We'll sort things out, eventually. It's the kind of geopolitical airport surprise that no frequent flyer miles can compensate for. Why this matters for Africa's future. 1. Rule of law. Test. Ghana prides itself as a democracy with functioning courts. This case will test whether judicial independence can hold against executive overreach and foreign pressure. 2. Human rights credibility. If Africa wants to be taken seriously in global forums, like the African Union pushing for a stronger UN Security Council role, it can't simultaneously look like a subcontractor for harsh US immigration policies. 3. Precedent for bilateral deals. If Ghana's deal survives scrutiny, other African states may be tempted to sign similar pacts, trading sovereignty for short-term diplomatic gains. 4. ECOWAS leadership. Question. Will ECOWAS step up with a collective voice or leave each member state to negotiate piecemeal with powerful external actors? The U.S. legal angle. A clever shortcut meets a stubborn judge. Back in Washington, this Ghana case is creating ripples that U.S. courts can't ignore. Several deportees, with the backing of NGOs, have already filed lawsuits in U.S. courts alleging that their removal through Ghana violated binding judicial orders. Judge Tanya Chutkan's red flag. Chutkan, sitting on the U.S. District Court in D.C., has questioned why migrants with withholding of removal or Convention Against Torture protections were sent to Ghana in the first place. These protections are supposed to be ironclad. They mean, you cannot deport me to my country of origin because I will face torture. The Trump administration's workaround was to send them elsewhere first, in this case, Ghana, with the understanding that Ghana would then quietly return them home. Chutkan didn't mince words. That looks suspiciously like an end run around U.S. law. The shackling allegations. Court filings describe deportees being shackled for the entire transatlantic flight, fed only bread and water, and in some cases, placed in what were essentially straitjackets. If true, this could amount to cruel and unusual punishment under U.S. constitutional standards, never mind international human rights law. Legal consequences for Washington. If U.S. courts rule that these third country deportations breach domestic and international law, the administration could face injunctions halting the practice. But here's the kicker. The deportees are already gone. So, what do? Order the U.S. government to fly them back? It's a legal mess that highlights how human beings can get caught in the machinery of geopolitics. Africa-Europe parallels. Déjà vu with a colonial aftertaste. If this feels familiar, it's because Europe has been running similar schemes for years. The EU-Libya model. The European Union struck deals with Libya to intercept migrants in the Mediterranean and detain them in Libyan camps. The result? Thousands trapped in horrific conditions with UN reports of torture, slavery, and sexual abuse. The EU got to brag about reduced migrant arrivals, while Libya became the scapegoat. Ghana now risks being drawn into a similar moral quagmire. Italy-Tunisia pact. Italy, desperate to curb arrivals across the central Mediterranean, signed a controversial migration deal with Tunisia in 2023. Critics dubbed it outsourcing cruelty, pointing out that Tunisia was itself unstable and unable to guarantee humane treatment of migrants. The UK-Rwanda experiment, Britain's plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, became one of the most infamous examples of this offshore outsourcing model. The UK Supreme Court struck it down in 2023, citing Rwanda's inability to guarantee safety. Yet the new British government is still tinkering with Plan B, and Rwanda has doubled down, presenting itself as a reliable partner. Where Ghana fits, Ghana risks becoming West Africa's mini Rwanda in the eyes of critics. The difference is that Ghana hasn't yet been promised cash or investment packages in exchange. Instead, the Mahama administration claims it's about humanitarian responsibility. But ask any Ghanaian taxi driver and you might hear, so we should feed America's deportees when our CDI can't even feed us? Forward-looking risks and opportunities. 1. Legal fallout in the U.S. If Judge Chutkan or higher courts rule against the practice, Ghana may find itself stuck in the middle of a diplomatic tug-of-war. Washington may quietly pressure Accra to keep the deal alive, while NGOs will pressure Ghana to shut it down. 2. African legal precedents. If Ghana's high court rules in favor of the deportees, it sets a benchmark for Africa, that courts can push back against executive overreach on international migration deals. This could embolden similar legal challenges in countries like Rwanda, Eswatini, and South Sudan. 3. The Pan-African question. Should African countries collectively negotiate with the US and Europe on migration? Rather than being picked off one by one, imagine ECOWAS or the AU demanding joint frameworks that protect rights while acknowledging migration pressures. That would flip the power dynamic. 4. Reputational stakes. Ghana, often praised as a beacon of African democracy, risks tarnishing its image. The country that hosted the Year of Return in 2019 to welcome African descendants is now accused of hosting deportees under questionable conditions. That's irony served cold, a little humor to end on, for now. The African Airbnb problem. At this rate, Ghana might start being seen as the Airbnb of deportees. The U.S. calls and says, "Hi, do you have space for 40 more guests?" Ghana replies, "Sure, but we don't provide breakfast, just detention tents." The deportees? They didn't even get to see the listing before check-in. It's absurd, but it captures the essence of the problem. People are being treated as luggage, shipped, stored, and claimed later. Why Africans risk it all? The youth migration drivers. 1. Demographics on steroids. Africa's population is exploding. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. Over 60% of the continent is under 25. That's not just a youth bulge, it's a youth tsunami. And while young people are full of energy, ambition, and TikTok dances, they're also staring down limited jobs and shrinking opportunities at home. 2. Unemployment and underemployment. Ghana's own youth. Unemployment hovers around 20% officially, but underemployment, selling airtime at traffic lights with a university degree, paints a grimmer picture. Across Africa, the formal sector cannot absorb the millions entering the labor market each year. Migration then isn't just desperation, it's strategy. 3. Education opportunity. Mismatch. We celebrate Africa's record university enrollments, but what happens when an engineering graduate in Lagos ends up as an Uber driver in New York, while back home potholes could swallow a cow? That mismatch is pushing young people to look abroad where their skills, ironically, are often better rewarded. 4. Conflict and climate. From Boko Haram's terror in Nigeria to desertification swallowing Sahel farmlands, conflict and climate stress are major accelerants. For many, the choice is between risking the Sahara or staying in a collapsing village economy. The economic angle, migration as Africa's shadow GDP. 1. Remittances, Africa's secret lifeline. In 2023, remittances to sub-Saharan Africa hit nearly $54 billion, World Bank. For Ghana alone, diaspora remittances make up 6% of GDP, sometimes more reliable than cocoa exports. This explains the paradox. While governments publicly frown on illegal migration, they quietly enjoy the foreign exchange diaspora dollars bring. 2. Brain drain versus brain gain. Doctors, nurses, and engineers leave Africa in droves. Nigeria reportedly loses over 2,000 doctors annually to the UK, and US Ghana's nurses are courted aggressively by the NHS. It's a brain drain that strains health systems. But there's also brain gain through remittances, skills transfer, and diaspora investment. The trick is how to balance it. 3. The deportee dilemma. Deportees disrupt this equation. They often return empty-handed, stigmatized, and unemployed. Communities view them as failures, yet they still carry trauma and debt from migration attempts. Now imagine Ghana being forced to warehouse not just its own deportees, but also those from other African countries. That's an economic and social powder keg. Flipping the script, from dumping ground to negotiating power, here's where Africa could stop playing defense and start playing chess. 1. Collective bargaining. If ECOWAS or the African Union acted as a bloc, they could demand migration partnerships instead of one-sided deportation deals. Europe and the US need Africa for minerals, energy, and global security cooperation. Why not make humane migration policies part of the bargain? 2. Diaspora bonds and investment. Instead of just remittances, countries like Ghana could issue diaspora bonds, structured investments that turn migrant dollars into infrastructure funding. India and Israel have used this to great effect. Why not Africa? 3. Stay and thrive. Agenda. Investing in job creation through agribusiness, tech hubs, and renewable energy projects could provide alternatives. Nigeria's tech scene shows what's possible. Lagos now produces more startup unicorns than Johannesburg. If young Africans see opportunity at home, the incentive to risk shackles abroad decreases. 4. Reframe the narrative. Rather than being passive recipients of deportees, African states could say, if you want us to host, then it must be on our terms, with funding, legal safeguards, and clear pathways for reintegration. Call it the African Migration Compact. A slice of humor. Ghana immigration, now hiring. Imagine the job ad: wanted, nation willing to host deportees no one else wants. Qualifications. Must have a functioning airport, pliable executive branch, and a military camp with space. Salary, diplomatic pats on the back. Risks, lawsuits, public anger, sovereignty headaches. Ghana didn't apply for this gig, yet here it is, inadvertently playing immigration landlord for Uncle Sam. Why this matters for Ghana and Africa's global role. 1. Agency versus dependency. Will African states always be junior partners, following external migration scripts, or will they assert collective agency? 2. Youth future. If the continent doesn't fix its economic engines, deportation lawsuits will become as common as power outages. 3. Global standing. Africa is fighting for a bigger role in global governance, UN reform, G20 membership. But moral authority is undermined if its states are seen as subcontractors for others' messy immigration policies. ECOWAS and the African Union, can regionalism save the day? 1. The ECOWAS Free Movement Puzzle. ECOWAS prides itself on the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, 1979, which allows citizens to travel visa-free across member states. But here's the catch. If deportees land in Ghana and are stateless, not Ghanaian, they technically could still attempt to move freely into Nigeria, Togo, or Côte d'Ivoire. That transforms Ghana's problem into a regional security and migration headache. Think of it like this. You lock your front door, Ghana, but the house, ECOWAS, has 14 other unlocked windows. Unless ECOWAS develops a collective stance on third country deportations, one country's agreement could compromise the whole bloc. 2. ECOWAS's silence equals consent. So far, ECOWAS has been conspicuously quiet. That silence risks being read as consent, emboldening the US or even Europe to negotiate more bilateral deals with weaker states. But history suggests ECOWAS only acts after a crisis. Recall how it intervened militarily in Gambia in 2017 to force Yahya Jammeh out after he refused to concede elections. Will deportation deals reach that level of urgency? Perhaps not, unless the number of stranded migrants balloons. 3. The AU's global bargaining chip. The African Union has bigger leverage. With 55 members, it can negotiate as a bloc with the EU and the US on migration. It has already tried this with the EU through the joint Africa-EU strategy. But implementation is patchy, and critics say the AU often folds under donor pressure. This Ghana case could be the spark for the AU to demand a continent-wide migration compact, ensuring any deal respects sovereignty, human rights, and development goals. Otherwise, Africa risks being sliced into receptacle states for unwanted migrants. Ghana's domestic politics. The 2028 election wildcard 1, the Mahama legacy. Question: John Mahama, back in power, has pitched himself as the man of international credibility. But this deportation saga risks undercutting that brand. Opposition MPs are already framing it as Mahama trading Ghana's sovereignty for US approval. For a man eyeing 2028 with history books in mind, this could be political dynamite. 2. Opposition's leverage. The New Patriotic Party, NPP, and smaller parties smell blood. Their talking points almost write themselves. Why is Ghana accepting foreigners the US doesn't want when our own youth lack jobs? If Nigeria can say no, why can't Ghana? This is Gitmo 2.0. Have we learned nothing? Remember the 2016 Gitmo detainee controversy? 2 Yemeni ex-detainees transferred to Ghana under a US deal became a full-blown election issue. This feels like deja vu. 3. The parliamentary battle. Opposition MPs are demanding parliamentary ratification under Article 75 of Ghana's 1992 Constitution. If the Speaker rules in their favor, the executive could be forced to table the deal. That would mean open debate, media frenzy, and possibly rejection. Imagine live parliamentary debates where MPs shout, "Are we a sovereign nation or America's dumping ground?" Ghana's democracy thrives on such drama. 4. Public sentiment. Ordinary Ghanaians are pragmatic. On the streets of Accra, the question isn't framed in legal jargon, it's framed in economics. If I can't find work here, why is the government spending money hosting deportees? In an election where youth unemployment will be front and center, the deportee issue could become symbolic of misplaced priorities. The bigger African picture, Ghana as a test case. This case is more than just Ghana's headache. It's a continental litmus test. If Ghana's courts push back, it signals that African democracies can hold their leaders accountable even under US pressure. If Ghana's parliament asserts its role, it sets a precedent for constitutional supremacy over executive overreach. If both fail, the message to other African states is clear. Executive shortcuts and secret MOUs are fair game in migration deals. And here's the uncomfortable question. If Ghana, one of Africa's strongest democracies, can be pressured into this, what hope is there for weaker states? Humor. Break, made in America, stored in Ghana. Picture a shipping container with a big US flag on one side and a Ghana flag on the other. The label reads, Contents, 14 deportees, handle with care, shipped from Washington, D.C. Storage facility, Accra Military Camp Customs Declaration, pending parliamentary approval. That's essentially what this deal looks like. Deportees turned into cargo, except they can sue, protest, and embarrass governments. The U.S. election lens, policy by boomerang. There's a reason Ghana suddenly finds itself trending in Washington legal filings. A hardline U.S. deportation push has leaned on third country off-ramps, move people whom U.S. courts said can't be returned home to a different place first, and let that place figure it out. Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan publicly flagged that logic as a possible end run around protections like withholding of removal and CAT, Convention Against Torture. Even as she said she lacked jurisdiction to stop the specific transfers already executed. Whether the White House keeps doubling down or trims the sails will be shaped by U.S. campaign incentives. If enforcement optics play well, expect continued pressure on African partners, Ghana included, to keep receiving plane loads and to facilitate onward removals. But the legal drag increases each week. Civil rights groups in the U.S. have sued over removals to Ghana of people with prior protections, arguing the scheme violates non-refoulement and due process. If injunctions land, Washington may be forced to redesign the playbook. And the facts on the ground keep contradicting the spin. Reuters reports Ghana agreed to accept West Africans deported from the U.S., with 14 arrivals already acknowledged. Ghana calls it humanitarian, not an endorsement of U.S. policy. Meanwhile, a Ghana lawsuit led by Oliver Barker-Vormawor says 11 remain detained and at risk if pushed to their home countries, a narrative that erodes the quick transit storyline. If U.S. judges keep spotlighting that gap, political blowback grows. Humor break? In American campaign season, even geography gets partisan. Secure the border now apparently includes the Gulf of Guinea. Next up, build a wall around Kotoka? Relax, that's a joke. Walls don't work on tarmacs. Regional dominoes. If Accra sneezes, ECOWAS catches a cold. Eswatini just demonstrated how quickly a quiet bilateral transfer becomes a regional PR and legal migraine. 5 men deported by the U.S. were held for months without charge in a maximum security prison. Amnesty demanded their whereabouts and lawyer access. Protesters gathered at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria. That's a small country, big headlines, and a cautionary tale for Ghana about reputational whiplash. Back to Ghana. The legal picture is crisping. Ghana's High Court Labor Division set an urgent hearing for September 23, 2025 on habeas and injunction applications. Media in Accra report some deportees are in a suspected military facility. The government says it's humanitarian transit. Those two realities can't coexist for long under constitutional scrutiny. Articles 14 and 23, liberty and administrative justice. Expect a ruling that either compels immediate due process fixes or freezes the MOU until Parliament weighs in. The ECOWAS factor. Once people are in Ghana, ECOWAS free movement rules create regional exposure. If Accra is perceived as a hub for U.S. removals, Abuja, Abidjan, and Lomé will feel the political draft and may harden positions against similar deals. Early signs. Nigeria-focused outlets and Pan-African media depict the case as illegal detention with sovereignty overtones, language that travels fast across the sub-region. Scenarios watch list, next 4 to 12 weeks. 1. Court-led reset in Accra. High Court grants habeas relief and/or interim injunctions. Detention conditions are regularized. Parliament is forced to scrutinize the MOU under Article 75. Net result, slower pipeline, higher due process costs, fewer quiet onward removals. Hearing date and filings already set in motion. 2. Humanitarian transit holds. For now. Executive discretion continues. Additional 40 arrivals proceed. Legal appeals drag in Ghana and the U.S. The reputational meter ticks up, especially if any onward removal leads to credible persecution claims. Ghana has signaled more arrivals are expected. 3. ECOWAS/AU coordination. Blocs adopt a minimum standards protocol. Lawyer access, detention limits, non-refoulement screens, parliamentary ratification. before any member accepts third country deportees. This is the chess move that flips leverage, but it needs political will, a commodity currently on backorder. Regional ripples evident from Eswatini to Ghana. Strategic implications for Ghana and playbook suggestions. A. Re-anchor in law, fast-track judicial review, and publish a detention rulebook, maximum 72-hour administrative hold, legal aid access, independent medical screening, and a public non-refoulement protocol. This preserves Ghana's rule of law brand and inoculates against U.S. courtroom scolding that boomerangs back via Reuters headlines. B. Legislative shielding. Invite Parliament to ratify or reject the MOU. If ratified with guardrails, the executive shares political risk and gains legitimacy. If rejected, Accra gets a democratic exit ramp without burning Washington bridges. Precedent prior treaty controversies over unratified security transfers. C. Regional diplomacy. Table an ECOWAS migration minimums memo. No third country intake without parliamentary oversight, capped durations, and joint monitoring. Pitch it in Abuja first. Nigeria's stance often sets the sub-regional weather. Media signals already show Nigeria adjacent scrutiny. D. Communications, reset. Stop calling this temporary facilitation if people sit in camps for weeks. Adopt transparent dashboards. Arrivals, legal status, releases, returns, updated weekly. It's harder for rumors to outrun data if the data is public. Meanwhile, in Washington, litigation as policy editor, AP and Reuters detail an awkward split screen. U.S. agencies tout removals, while U.S. judges and advocates flag due process and refoulement risks, particularly where immigration judges had already granted protection. If one federal injunction sticks, the supply line to Accra chokes, and Ghana is left holding legal liabilities, not transit guests. That's why Accra's safest hedge is process, not promises. One more humor beat, the two-stop ticket deportee. I had a one-way ticket home. Airline. Correction, you have a two-stop, DC to Accra to danger. Please keep your shackles fastened until we reach cruising altitude Ghana. We prefer hand luggage, not human luggage. Yes, it's dark humor, but it underscores the absurdity of treating people like parcels with complicated routing numbers. 3 policy blueprints for Ghana and beyond. 1. Due process code of practice. Ghana can publish a binding code of practice for any third country deportees. Key points: 72-hour limit on administrative detention without charge. Mandatory lawyer access within 24 hours. Independent medical and psychological screening on arrival. Transparent non-refoulement screening. No one moved onward until a panel certifies safety. This isn't just law. It's optics. By codifying rights, Ghana signals to its citizens and the world, we are not a dumping ground, we are a rule of law state. 2. Parliamentary ratification path. Instead of ad hoc MOUs, Ghana's executive can table a treaty bill under Article 75 of the Constitution. Parliament can debate terms publicly, sharing political risk, insert sunset clauses, e.g., deal expires in 12 months unless renewed. Attach conditions, funding for reintegration, human rights monitoring, and caps on numbers. This transforms a controversial executive decision into a democratic contract. 3. ECOWAS minimums proposal. Ghana can flip embarrassment into leadership by tabling a regional migration minimums protocol in Abuja. No third country deportees without parliamentary oversight. Regional burden sharing fund, financed partly by diaspora bonds. Joint ECOWAS oversight committee to inspect detention centers. Collective bargaining with the U.S. and EU for development aid tied to legal safeguards. Instead of Ghana standing alone, ECOWAS as a bloc negotiates from strength. Advice to African leaders: don't rent out your sovereignty. African leaders face the same dilemma, balancing external pressure with domestic legitimacy. Here's the counsel. 1. Guard the Constitution. If a deal cannot pass parliamentary scrutiny, it probably shouldn't be signed in secret. Short-term diplomacy is not worth long-term erosion of sovereignty. 2. Use migration as leverage, not liability. Africa's youth are its strongest export through remittances, skills, and diaspora investment. Don't reduce them to bargaining chips in somebody else's border war. 3. Think regionally, act collectively. A lone state is easy prey for superpowers, but an ECOWAS or AU protocol sets red lines and creates bargaining weight. 4. Humanize the debate. Deportees are not cargo. They are workers, parents, and dreamers. Policies that treat them as luggage breed resentment and lawsuits. 5. Invest in stay and thrive. Migration pressure is ultimately a reflection of weak economies. Investing in jobs, education, and climate resilience is not charity. It's the only firewall against future deportation sagas. Summary of key messages. Ghana's lawsuit over unlawful detention of U.S. deportees is a test case at the intersection of sovereignty, human rights, and geopolitics. U.S. courts are already flagging the legal gymnastics of third country deportations. Ghana now faces reputational and constitutional tests of its own. ECOWAS and the AU risk irrelevance if they stay silent. Regional protocols are urgently needed to prevent dumping ground dynamics. With elections looming, Ghana's handling could swing from diplomatic coup to political liability if youth see deportees getting more government attention than unemployed citizens. Africa must flip the script. Treat migration as a source of negotiating power, diaspora capital, labor, remittances, not as a burden forced by external powers. And here's the part worth engraving above every African cabinet table. Don't rent out your sovereignty. Migration can be Africa's leverage, not its liability, if only we negotiate together, stand by our constitutions, and remember that people are not parcels. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa's stories are told with courage, context, and conviction. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our bold take on Africa's unfolding stories. Together, let's keep Africa's voice loud, proud, and unstoppable.